There are stories of escape that echo through history, daring flights to freedom under cover of darkness, brave souls who ran and never looked back. But Sallie Crane's story is different. Sallie didn't just escape once, she escaped 3 times, and each time she made a choice that defied every instinct for self-preservation. She went back into the heart of slavery, back into the chains she had broken, back into the plantation that had stolen her youth, her dignity, her very name. Why would anyone do such a thing? Why would a woman who had tasted the sweet air of freedom willingly return to bondage? The answer is simple, yet profound enough to shake your soul. Her children were still there. This is the story of a mother's love so fierce it conquered fear itself. A woman's determination so unbreakable that even the institution of slavery couldn't contain it, and a journey so harrowing that it would test the very limits of human endurance. Before we begin, ask yourself this question: what would you risk everything for? By the time Sallie's story is told, you'll understand that some bonds are stronger than chains, some loves are deeper than suffering, and some spirits simply cannot be broken. The first taste of freedom the Alabama sun beat down mercilessly on the cotton fields of the Crane plantation in the summer of 1852, and Sallie's hands moved with the mechanical precision of someone who had picked cotton since she could walk. She was 23 years old, though she looked both younger and older. Younger in her smooth, unlined face, older in her eyes that had seen too much. Her back ached with a familiar pain, the kind that lived in her bones now, a permanent resident that never paid rent and never left. But today something was different. Today, beneath the rhythm of her picking, beneath the songs the other enslaved people hummed to make the hours pass, beneath the watchful eye of the overseer on his horse, Sallie's mind was somewhere else entirely. It was 3 miles north, in a small cabin where her 3 children waited for her return each evening. Sarah, aged 7, Thomas, aged 5, and little Margaret, barely 3 years old, with her father's eyes and her mother's defiant spirit. Sallie had been separated from their father 2 years prior, when Master Crane sold him to a plantation in Mississippi. She never saw him again, never got to say goodbye. One morning he was there, holding baby Margaret, kissing her forehead. By afternoon he was gone, shackled to a coffle of other enslaved people being marched south. Sallie had screamed until her voice gave out. She had beaten her fists against the door of her cabin until they bled. And then, when the rage subsided, she had made a promise to herself. Her children would not suffer the same fate. They would not grow old in bondage. They would not live and die as property. The plan had taken shape slowly, carefully, over months of whispered conversations and stolen moments. There was a network, she had heard, people who helped the enslaved reach freedom. The Underground Railroad, they called it, though it was neither underground nor a railroad. It was people, brave, foolhardy, magnificent people, who risked everything to guide runaways north to free states and beyond to Canada. Sallie had made contact through old James, a man who drove Master Crane's supply wagon into town. Old James knew people, heard things, and one day he had pulled Sallie aside and whispered a single word: "Ready?" She had nodded, though her heart hammered in her chest like a trapped bird. "Not without my children," she had whispered back. Old James had looked at her with something like pity, something like admiration. "That makes it harder," he had said, "much harder." But Sallie had never chosen the easy path. Easy was accepting bondage. Easy was watching her children grow up as someone else's property. Easy was giving up. And Sallie Crane had never been good at giving up. The night of the escape arrived on a moonless evening in late August. Sallie had told her children they were going on an adventure, a special journey, but they had to be very, very quiet. Sarah, wise beyond her years, understood more than she let on. Thomas, excited by the prospect of an adventure, could barely contain his energy. Little Margaret simply held tight to her mother's skirt, trusting in the way only small children can. They left at midnight, when the plantation had settled into uneasy sleep. Sallie carried Margaret on her hip, held Sarah's hand, and Thomas clung to her other side. Every snap of a twig beneath their feet sounded like cannon fire. Every hoot of an owl seemed like an alarm. Sallie's heart beat so loudly she was certain it would wake the dead. They moved through the woods following directions old James had given her. North by the stars. Follow the creek until it splits, then take the western branch. Look for a barn with a red door. Inside there would be help. The journey that should have taken an hour stretched into 3. Thomas's little legs grew tired, and Sallie had to carry both him and Margaret, one on each hip, her arms screaming in protest. Sarah stumbled in the darkness, scratching her legs on thorns, but she didn't cry out. She had learned young that tears were a luxury enslaved children couldn't afford. When they finally saw the barn, Sallie nearly wept with relief. But relief turned to terror when they heard the dogs. The baying started distant but grew closer, unmistakable in its purpose. Someone had discovered them missing. Someone had set the hounds on their trail. Sallie ran. She ran with a strength she didn't know she possessed, her children bouncing against her body, Sarah sprinting alongside her. They burst through the barn door, and a man and woman, white Quakers Sallie would later learn, immediately sprang into action. "The cellar," the man said urgently, pulling up a hidden trapdoor. "Quickly now." They descended into darkness, into a space so small that Sallie had to crouch, her children pressed against her. Above, she heard boots on wood, heard voices, heard the dogs snuffling and whining. She pressed her hand over Margaret's mouth as the little girl began to whimper. "Shh, baby," she breathed into her daughter's ear. Quiet as a mouse, quiet as the stars. The voices above grew louder. Sallie recognized the overseer's drawl, recognized Master Crane's clipped, authoritative tone. Her blood ran cold. They were searching the barn. The Quaker man's voice joined the others, calm and steady, explaining that he had seen no one, that perhaps the dogs had picked up a false trail, that surely runaway slaves wouldn't be foolish enough to come to a known abolitionist's barn. The conversation seemed to last hours. Margaret trembled against Sallie. Little Thomas buried his face in his mother's chest, and Sarah sat perfectly still, her small hand gripping Sallie's arm with surprising strength. Finally, the voices faded. The boots retreated. The barn door closed. But they stayed in the cellar until dawn, not daring to move, not daring to hope. When the Quaker man finally opened the trap door, his face was grave. "They'll be back," he said. "They always come back. You need to move on, and quickly." The Quakers fed them, gave them fresh clothes, and sent them on to the next station with a guide, a free black man named Isaiah, who knew the routes like the back of his hand. For 3 weeks they traveled by night and hid by day. They waded through streams to throw off the dogs. They huddled in secret rooms and false-bottomed wagons. They ate when they could and went hungry when they couldn't. Sarah grew thinner. Thomas developed a cough that worried Sallie deeply. But they pushed on, always north, always toward the promise of freedom. Isaiah told them stories as they walked, stories of people who had made it to Canada, who had built new lives, who had sent word back that they were truly free. Sallie clung to these stories like lifelines. On a cool September morning, they crossed into Pennsylvania, a free state. Sallie stood on free soil for the first time in her life. Her children gathered around her, and she wept. Not delicate tears, but great heaving sobs that came from somewhere deep in her soul. She was free. Her children were free. They had done it. Isaiah led them to a small community of free black people in Philadelphia, where they were welcomed with open arms. Sallie found work as a laundress, hard work but paid work. Work she did for herself. She rented a small room where all 4 of them slept together, cramped but safe. For 6 months they built a life. Sarah started to learn her letters from a kind woman in their boarding house. Thomas's cough faded. Margaret began to laugh again, a sound Sallie had feared she might never hear. But freedom had a bitter taste Sallie hadn't anticipated. In the quiet moments, when her children slept and she sat alone with her thoughts, Sallie thought of those she had left behind. Her sister Anna, still enslaved on the Crane plantation. The women who had helped raise her, who had sung songs over her when she was sick, who had celebrated with her when her children were born. The children who played with Sarah and Thomas, who were still there, still picking cotton under that merciless Alabama sun. And then the letter came. It arrived in December, delivered by a man who had just come up from the South. It was from old James, smuggled north through the network of brave souls who carried messages along with people. The letter was simple, written in someone else's hand because old James couldn't write. But the words burned into Sallie's heart. "Your sister Anna is to be sold. Master Crane needs money. She'll be gone by spring." Sallie read those words over and over until they blurred. Her sister. Her baby sister, just 19 years old, about to be sold away to God knows where, to face God knows what horrors. In a free state, in a free life, Sallie was powerless to stop it. Or was she? The idea came to her in the dark hours of the night, an idea so dangerous, so audacious that it should have been dismissed immediately. But it wasn't an idea. She could shake. It grew in her mind like a living thing, taking root, demanding attention. She could go back. She could return to Alabama, help Anna escape, and bring her north to freedom. Everyone she told thought she was mad. The people in her community begged her to reconsider. "You've escaped," they said. "You're safe now. Don't throw that away." Isaiah himself came to talk sense into her. "Sallie," he said, his eyes grave with concern, "you go back there, and you might never leave again. They'll be watching for you. They'll punish you severe for running. Is it worth the risk?" Sallie looked at him steadily. "If it was your sister," she said quietly, "would you ask that question?" Isaiah had no answer for that. Sallie made arrangements for her children. A family in the community, the Johnsons, agreed to care for them while she was gone. It nearly killed her to leave them, to kiss their sleeping faces and slip away in the night. But she couldn't risk taking them back into slavery. This was her burden to bear, her choice to make. The journey south was faster than the journey north had been. Sallie knew the routes now, knew the safe houses, knew how to move quickly and quietly. She carried forged papers saying she was a free woman named Ruth traveling to visit family, papers that would hold up under casual inspection but wouldn't survive serious scrutiny. She made it back to Alabama in February, arriving at the Crane plantation under cover of darkness. The shock on Anna's face and Sallie appeared at her cabin door was worth every risk, every mile, every moment of fear. "You came back," Anna whispered, gripping her sister's hands as though afraid she might disappear. "They said you'd run north. I thought I'd never see you again." "I came for you," Sallie said simply. "Get your things. We leave tonight." But fate had other plans. As they prepared to slip away, young Thomas Crane, the master's son, saw movement near the slave quarters. He raised the alarm, and within minutes the plantation erupted in chaos. Sallie and Anna ran, but there was nowhere to hide, nowhere to go that the hounds couldn't find them. They were caught before they reached the woods. Sallie remembered the look on Master Crane's face when he saw her, a mixture of fury and something like disbelief. "I knew you'd come back," he said coldly. "Your kind always does. Too stupid to stay free when you get the chance." The punishment was severe. Sallie was whipped until her back was raw, until she couldn't stand, until she begged for mercy that didn't come. She was locked in the punishment shed for 3 days with no food and little water. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the agony in her heart. She had failed. She had left her children for nothing. Anna was still enslaved, and now Sallie was too, with no prospect of escape, no hope of return. In the darkness of that shed, bleeding and broken, Sallie made a new vow. She had failed this time, but she would not fail forever. She would escape again. She would reach her children, and she would not stop until every person she loved was free, or she was dead. Some promises she had learned were stronger than chains. Some loves were worth dying for. The months following Sallie's recapture were the darkest she had ever known. Master Crane, determined to break what he called her rebellious spirit, assigned her to the harshest labor on the plantation. She worked in the fields from before dawn until well after dark, her healing back screaming with every movement. At night she was locked in a small cabin with 2 other women, the door barred from outside to prevent any thoughts of running. But Master Crane had made a fundamental miscalculation. He believed that sufficient suffering would crush Sallie's will, would teach her the futility of resistance. He didn't understand that suffering can also forge steel. With every lash, every indignity, every moment of despair, Sallie's resolve hardened. She would get back to her children. Nothing else mattered. Letters from Philadelphia came sporadically, smuggled in by sympathetic souls who risked much to carry them. The Johnsons wrote that Sarah, Thomas, and little Margaret were well, that they asked for their mother every day, that they were being cared for with love. These letters were both Sallie's salvation and her torture. Her children were safe, growing up free, but they were growing up without her. Sarah would be 8 soon, Thomas was 6, Margaret was learnin'. to write her name. Sallie was missing everything. Anna, guilt-stricken over her sister's recapture, became Sallie's co-conspirator. Together, in whispered conversations during the brief moments they could steal, they began planning again. Not an escape just for themselves this time, but something larger. There were 12 children on the Crane plantation under the age of 10, children who would grow up in bondage if someone didn't act. Sallie's ambition had grown with her suffering. If she was going to risk everything again, she would make it count. The plan took a year to develop. A year of carefully cultivated relationships, of stored supplies hidden in hollow trees and abandoned buildings, of memorized routes and coded messages. Sallie worked harder than anyone, never complained, played the role of the broken, obedient slave so convincingly that the overseer began to relax his watch. She was, he told Master Crane, finally learning her place. In truth, Sallie was learning something else entirely. She was learning that patience could be a weapon, that submission could be a disguise, and that the careful planning of a determined woman could move mountains. The second escape came in the spring of 1854, nearly 2 years after Sallie's recapture. This time, she didn't travel alone, or with just Anna. This time, she led a group of 8 people: Anna, 2 other young women, and 5 children, including a baby. It was audacious to the point of madness, but Sallie had learned that the most outrageous plans sometimes worked because they were too bold to be anticipated. They left on a Sunday night when the white families were at a revival meeting in town, when the overseer was drunk, when the plantation was as unguarded as it would ever be. Sallie had arranged for a wagon driven by a sympathetic free black man to be waiting 3 miles north. They had to reach it before dawn. The journey with children was agonizing. The baby cried and had to be constantly soothed. One of the young women twisted her ankle and had to be half-carried. One of the children, a boy of 6, was terrified and kept wanting to turn back. But Sallie drove them forward with a will that would not be denied. Freedom or death, she told them when they faltered. Those are the only 2 choices. Pick one and move. They made it to the wagon. They made it to the first safe house. They made it through Pennsylvania and into New York. For 3 miraculous weeks, Sallie dared to hope. She had done it. She had not only escaped a second time, but had brought 8 others with her. The Underground Railroad conductors who helped them spoke her name with reverence. Sallie Crane, they said, the woman who won't stay caught. In Philadelphia, Sallie was reunited with her children in a moment so intense with emotion that everyone who witnessed it wept. Sarah, now 9, clung to her mother and wouldn't let go. Thomas, 6, kept touching Sallie's face as though to make sure she was real. Margaret, now Ive, had grown so much that Sallie barely recognized her at first. They held each other and cried, and for a brief, shining moment, Sallie's world was complete. But completeness is a fragile thing. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 meant that even in free states, escaped slaves could be captured and returned to their owners. Slave catchers prowled northern cities, looking for runaways, collecting bounties. Master Crane had posted a substantial reward for Sallie's return, not because she was particularly valuable as a worker, but because her escapes had become an embarrassment, a challenge to his authority that he couldn't let stand. Sallie had been back in Philadelphia for just 6 weeks when they came for her. It was early morning, and she was walking to the house where she worked as a laundress. 4 men surrounded her, rough men with cold eyes and legal papers. "You're Sallie, property of James Crane of Alabama," one of them said. It wasn't a question. Sallie fought. She screamed for help and people came running, but the slave catchers had the law on their side. Federal marshals were there to ensure the Fugitive Slave Act was enforced. Sympathetic bystanders could only watch, helpless and enraged, as Sallie was shackled and thrown into a wagon. The last thing she saw as the wagon pulled away was Sarah's face in the crowd, her daughter's mouth open in a scream Sallie couldn't hear over the noise and chaos. The last thought she had before grief overwhelmed her was simple and devastating. I failed them again. The return to Alabama was a journey through hell. Sallie was transported in chains, treated worse than livestock, beaten when she tried to speak to other captured runaways also being returned south. When she arrived back at the Crane plantation, Master Crane's rage was cold and calculated. He didn't whip her this time. He did something worse. He sold Anna. "That's what you get," he told Sallie as Anna was led away in chains, sold to a cotton plantation in the deep South, to a place where the labor was so brutal that people rarely survived more than a few years. "That's what you get for running. Everyone you love will pay until you learn." Sallie's spirit should have broken then. By every reasonable measure, she should have given up. She was separated from her children by hundreds of miles and the law itself. Her sister was gone, sold into almost certain death. She was watched constantly, her every move scrutinized, her life constrained to the point of suffocation. But Sallie Crane was not a reasonable woman. Grief transformed into rage, rage into determination, and determination into a plan so dangerous that even she knew it was probably suicide. She would escape a third time, and this time she wouldn't just run north. She would stay in Alabama long enough to find out where Anna had been sold. She would rescue her sister one more time, and then she would make a final run to her children, and God help anyone who tried to stop her. The third escape took 9 months to plan. Sallie was careful, so careful that she barely breathed without thinking through the consequences. She convinced Master Crane's wife that she had found religion, had repented, had accepted her lot in life. She sang hymns in the fields, loud enough for everyone to hear. She worked without complaint. She became, to all appearances, exactly what they wanted her to be: defeated. In secret, she saved every scrap of food she could hide. She stole a knife from the kitchen and hid it in the lining of her one spare dress. She made contact, through a network of trusted people, with conductors who could help her if she made it north one more time. And she learned, through whispered conversations and past notes, where Anna had been sold. The escape came in December of 1854, on a night so cold that the overseers stayed inside by their fires. Sallie slipped away from her locked cabin through a window she had loosened over weeks of patient work. She ran south this time, not north, toward the plantation where Anna suffered. It took her 3 days to reach it, 3 days of hiding in barns and abandoned buildings, of stealing food and avoiding roads, of pushing her body beyond exhaustion. When she finally saw Anna again, working in a cotton field that stretched to the horizon, Sallie's heart broke at the change in her sister. Anna was skeletal, her eyes hollow, her hands bleeding from the rough work, but when she saw Sallie, something like life returned to her. "Face, I told you I'd come," Sallie whispered when they met that night in Anna's cabin. "I told you I'd never stop trying." They left the next night, this time heading north with a desperate urgency. They had nothing but the clothes on their backs and Sallie's stolen knife. They ate roots and berries. They walked until their feet bled, then walked some more. Twice they nearly froze to death. Once they were almost caught by a patrol and had to hide in a frozen stream until the men passed, emerging blue and shaking but alive. It took them 6 weeks to reach Pennsylvania, 6 weeks that should have killed them but didn't. When they finally crossed into free territory, they collapsed in the first safe house they reached, too exhausted to even celebrate their freedom. Sallie had promised herself she would go straight to her children, but Anna was sick, desperately sick from the cold and malnutrition and the brutal treatment she'd endured. She needed time to heal, and Sallie couldn't bring herself to leave her sister again, not after everything they'd survived. So she stayed, nursing Anna back to health in a small room in Philadelphia, working during the day and sitting vigil at night. It took 3 months before Anna was well enough to travel, 3 months during which Sallie's children were so close and yet still out of reach. Finally, on a spring morning in 1855, Sallie and Anna walked through the door of the Johnson family home where Sallie's children had been living for nearly 3 years. The children had grown so much that Sallie barely recognized them at first. Sarah was nearly 10, tall and serious, helping Mrs. Johnson with household tasks. Thomas was 7, learning to read and full of questions about everything. Margaret was 6, shy but bright-eyed, with Sallie's stubborn chin. The reunion was quieter than Sallie had imagined it would be. Her children had lived without her for so long that she was almost a stranger to them. They remembered her, called her Mama, but there was a distance that hurt worse than any whipping. She had saved them, given them freedom, but she had also lost years of their lives she would never get back. It would have been easy to let bitterness consume her, to rage against the system that had forced her to make impossible choices. But Sallie chose differently. She chose to be grateful for every day she had with her children from that point forward. She chose to build a new life, brick by brick, moment by moment. Over the years that followed, Sallie worked tirelessly. She became a laundress, one of the best in Philadelphia, and eventually saved enough to rent a small house where her family could live together. She taught her children about the plantation, about where they came from, but also about the future they could build. She became active in the Abolitionist movement, speaking to groups about her experiences, raising money to help other runaways. When the Civil War broke out in 1861, Sallie's oldest, Sarah, wanted to go south to help the contraband slaves fleeing to Union lines. Sallie was terrified but said yes, understanding that freedom was something each generation had to fight for in their own way. Thomas eventually became a teacher, educating formerly enslaved children. Margaret became a midwife, helping bring new free babies into the world. Anna never fully recovered from her time on that brutal plantation. She lived with Sallie until her death in 1867, surrounded by family, dying free if not fully healed. Before she passed, she took Sallie's hand and whispered, "You saved me. 3 times you put yourself in danger to save me. I could never repay that." Sallie kissed her sister's forehead. "Love isn't about repayment," she said softly. "It's about showing up, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard." Sallie Crane lived until 1899, long enough to see the end of slavery, long enough to see her children build lives she had only dreamed of, long enough to hold her grandchildren and tell them stories of a time they could barely imagine. When she died at 70, surrounded by 3 generations of free descendants, her last words were simple: "I kept my promise." Her tombstone in a Philadelphia cemetery is modest, but those who knew her story made sure it bore a single line beneath her name and dates: "She escaped 3 times and saved those she loved." Sallie's story reminds us that heroism isn't always loud or celebrated in the moment. Sometimes it's a mother making an impossible choice, knowing the cost but paying it anyway. Sometimes it's a woman returning to hell because someone she loves is still trapped there. Sometimes it's the quiet persistence of showing up, day after day, refusing to let the world break what matters most. In our own lives, we may never face choices as stark as Sallie's, but we all face moments when we must decide what we're willing to sacrifice for those we love, what principles we'll stand for even when it costs us, what promises we'll keep even when keeping them seems impossible. Sallie's answer to those questions was clear. Everything, all of them, always. Her legacy isn't just freedom, though that would be enough. It's the reminder that love, fierce, unbreakable, willing to walk into fire love, is the most powerful force in human history. It's stronger than chains, stronger than laws, stronger than the institutions that tell us some people matter less than others. Sallie Crane proved that truth with her life, and her descendants carry that truth forward every day they live free. So the next time you face a difficult choice, when you wonder if your sacrifice matters, when you question whether one person can really make a difference, remember Sallie. Remember that she escaped 3 times when once should have been impossible. Remember that she returned to slavery when she could have stayed free. Remember that she never stopped fighting, never stopped loving, never stopped believing that freedom was worth any price. Oz. In the end, that's what changes the world. Ordinary people making extraordinary choices, one brave decision at a time. Sallie Crane was one of those people, and her story challenges us to ask ourselves, when our moment comes, what will we choose? Who will we fight for? What promises will we keep? The answer to those questions defines not just our lives, but the legacy we leave for those who come after. Make it count. Make Sallie proud.